Hello, and welcome to the West Building Lecture Hall of the National Gallery of Art. I'm Eric Denker, the head of Tours and Lectures for Adults here at the National Gallery, and I'm pleased to be here with you to welcome and to discuss Pastels with Daniel Massad, who is represented in the exhibition that we have up at the moment of The Touch of Color, the pastels from the permanent collection of the National Gallery of Art. The pastels are very fragile and they are sensitive to light, so we don't often have them up, and this is a great opportunity. The 64 have been chosen carefully from the collection, and they have been divided between three rooms. A room of 18th century pastel artists, including one of the great initiators of the pastel tradition, Rosalba Carriera, including Maurice Quentin de la Tour, including important French and English artists of the 18th century. And then a second room, which is devoted to the gallery's very strong collection of 19th century pastels, including the work of Millet, Manet, Monet, including the work of Cassatt, and in many ways the star of the exhibition, Edgar Degas. And then a third room, which includes 20th century pastels, mostly American, and then pastels by four contemporary artists, and that includes Etta Renouf and Janet Fish and Jasper Johns and Dan Massad. And so we're very pleased to have Dan with us and very fortunate to have him here to discuss pastel with us. We will be talking to Dan about his particular pastels, but I will give you a very brief background, and that is that Dan is in Annville, Pennsylvania. He is artist in residence at Lebanon Valley College. This is not far from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He has been working in pastel for many years, and he has pastels in major collections around the country, distinguished collections. And so his work is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, here in Washington, both at the National Gallery and at the Museum of American Art. And he was the subject of a recent retrospective at the Palmer Gallery in Penn State, Penn State College in Pennsylvania, and more recently a smaller show at the Arnold Gallery in Annville. And so we're very pleased to have him here with us, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dan here today. We'll start with a few basic questions, and then Dan will talk more about the conception and evolution of his work. He has a very charming story that shows his first connections with art that I thought would be a very good opening. And so, Dan, why don't you talk about that?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Yes, it seems the right place to tell this story. I grew up in Oklahoma City, part of the Lebanese American community in Oklahoma City. And at the age of 10, my parents decided I was an old enough 10-year-old for me to accompany my father, just the two of us, on a trip to Washington, D.C. I should add that there were no art museums in Oklahoma City at that time, and no art galleries, I think, at that time. None that my family knew of, and I had never seen anything called an oil painting. At any rate, on Dad's first day of business meetings, he dropped me off at the National Gallery of Art. This is before there were such things as helicopter parents and cell phones or anything else like that. So I wandered the West Building on my own. And I think it's accurate to say that I fell in love with paintings, with oil paintings, Rembrandt and Giorgione and Botticelli and Degas and especially Vermeer and especially Chardin, and especially Chardin's still lifes, not the genre scenes. Why a 10-year-old would have responded that way. I don't have the full answer to that, but that is how I responded. And I think I also saw on these walls a future for me as an adult. I wanted to learn how to make these objects. So I asked my parents when I got back home if there was any way they could find a teacher in Oklahoma City who taught this thing called oil painting, because I read all the labels without understanding them. And there was a painter, a full-time professional painter, Richard Getz. Actually, he and Edith Getz were both full-time painters, and they taught children at the Oklahoma City Public Library on Saturdays the basic rudiments of drawing and painting from a single vantage point. So another way of saying that is that I began to be academically trained. It's not what I asked for, but that's what happened, starting at the age of 10. And because I wanted to do this, I learned very quickly. I got very deft at that particular tradition of creating plausible, believable, two-dimensional images of three-dimensional objects seen from a single vantage point. And in a very painterly fashion, lots of visible mark making. So that's where that began. When I was heading toward college, my parents balked. They did not want to support me majoring in art or going to an art school. And because of the wonderful influence of my greatest high school teacher, my Latin teacher, I applied to a whole lot of colleges and universities and got this acceptance to Princeton, of all places, which I had really hardly heard of. So I went there, and I majored in English. There was actually no studio arts program at Princeton in 1965. But the year after I got there, they imported some studio artists, and one of them was Toshiko Takasu, the ceramic sculptor and painter. And I took my first ceramics class with her, and she became one of the probably the most important lifelong influence on my life, as well as indirectly on my work, until her death a few years ago. So I left Princeton with this degree that was good, interesting to pursue. I love literature, I love writing, but also with this connection to Takasu and my first box of pastels, which I had taken with me on a hitchhiking tour through Northern Europe summer after my sophomore year. A box of Rembrandts for those pastelists and you want to know these technical things, and I still use Rembrandt pastel, and we can talk about why if you want to ask that question. So I went, just very quickly, I went on to get a master's in English from the University of Chicago. Then I went through 2 years of training in Rogerian psychotherapy, and I practiced for 5 years. And by the time I reached my early 30s, I realized that I couldn't go on in my life doing either of these wonderful things, getting the PhD in English or getting more training in psychotherapy. I loved that work too. But there was an initial thing that I wanted to do that I hadn't done, and that was to try to become a full-time artist. My little mantra was, I want to make a living, not to make money, just to make a living making the work that mattered to me. Looking back on that, I think, what the heck was I? Oh my God, it was pretty ambitious of me. So I was accepted into the MFA program at the University of Kansas, where I got my master's in painting, ultimately. And
later on, moving to Annville and
yes.
becoming the artist in residence. What was it that attracted you to pastel?
I think I don't have the full answer to that question either. One part of it was that my very early training in oil painting gave me a lot, but it also made it difficult for me to find my own voice, if you will, on canvas. I didn't really know who I was as a painter. Pastel, on the other hand, was a medium that I just simply picked up on my own. No one has ever taught me how to use pastel. And I began to use it in various ways, clumsy ways, experimental ways from the beginning, literally teaching myself as I went along the way. I think that entry into the medium was a powerful reason why the medium has stuck with me. And I've worked now exclusively in pastel for the past 40 years, and I think in pastel. When I'm thinking my images, which begin up here always, I'm thinking that surface and what I can do with it. It's also true that as a kid I loved playing in the dirt. I did. I was a dirty little kid. Central Oklahoma, red clay dirt, which I still love to revisit. Well, I was down in the dirt digging with my hands. I was a gardener. And then meeting Takasu in college, there I was with dirt, clay. And the Rembrandt pastels, a particular formula they use is kaolin, which is the clay they used in porcelain, ground pure pigment, and a ground resin as a binder. That's what soft pastel is made out of. So in a way, there is this tactile thing that keeps happening for me, where I'm with my medium in my hands, and I'm just really comfortable with that.
This is an audience and the live streaming as well, which is always very interested in process. And so perhaps we should move on to the slides, okay. And you can talk in terms of the slides. And what we'll do, you can see Breach, which is in the National Gallery's collection and on view in that third room. But you can see that because of the lighting conditions, it's a little bit washed out here. And so what we will do will, in fact, be to darken the room along the way so that you can really see the details as Dan talks about them.
Okay. I'm going to go back a bit here. I can look at this. When I entered the master's program at University of Kansas, one of my intentions, very conscious intentions, was to push my little envelope of academic training. Now, I was there to experiment, and I was working with a wide-ranging faculty. This wasn't a school with a particular style they taught. This was anything and everything going on in the faculty. So I felt a sense of freedom to push myself from one scale to another, one paper surface to another, or canvas, one paint applications. I just was changing up everything. At this point, I was about a year and a half into the program. I was working with Roger Shimamura, who was my mentor in the program. And I had come in drawing from the academic tradition and drawing the figure primarily. And then I began to break the figure down. I was doing a lot of free mark making. There's no erasure here. This is all additive drawing. I began to break the figure down into parts and to examine those parts, look at them as sculptural entities, and play with them from different angles, and then to recombine them into larger images that look, it's sort of like you're in the first balcony of a theater looking down on the stage, maybe. But although I called this, I didn't really know what was about to happen to me, the Tabletop series, a very short series of about 4 works. I finished this one, and Roger, this is a work by Roger at that time, one of his prints. Roger said to me, Dan, you're reinventing yourself as an artist every 3 weeks, and I'm getting a little dizzy. And I want you to go back to what you know best. And when you change anything, change one thing at a time. That's all the directive he gave me. And I went back to my little studio area, very glum, because I didn't want to be taking any vacations. I was dead serious about being in graduate school and doing this work. But I followed his advice, and I thought, well, what do I know best? I know still life. That's where I began. I fell in love with Chardin's still life. My dad bought me the little book, the Skira book, the square book on Chardin, which I still have. And this is a painting by Richard Getz, my first teacher. ordinary objects on a tabletop. And this was my first painting in Goetz's class at the age of 10, with Goetz's help. So when I asked myself what I wanted to change, which was Roger's directive, only one thing at a time, the first thing that came to me was composition. I wanted to move away from that pyramidal Renaissance composition where all the important objects are in the center of the image. And when I did that, I began to have mind's eye images, ideas that sort of flashed into my mind's eye, and all the objects began to move off to the side. You can see here I'm still making painterly marks with the soft pastel on the paper. The center got emptier, and then I began to feel that these preliminary ideas, which were turning into full-scale preliminary drawings in pencil, were getting sharper and sharper, and I wanted that clarity in the pastels. I wanted to sort of wipe the window clean so that you could look through it and see with clarity the structure of the work. I didn't know if it were possible to make sharp-edged, precisionist shapes with pastel, but again, I was experimenting, so I went forward and created a body of work that became my thesis show in the MFA program. I actually had to argue formally for pastel as a painting medium, because we all think of it as maybe a drawing medium or a sketching medium or whatever. Well, I was solving painting problems in my mind with pastel. But it was a short argument. They let me through. This is called Great Plains. And the final piece for the show was a triptych, a 3-part invention. And then I moved to Pennsylvania, where it rains a lot more than it does in Kansas, or at least it rains for longer periods. But I also wanted the palette to change. I was at a point where I wanted it to deepen emotionally, so the palette got darker, earthier, and I had completely, by this time, abandoned the tabletop, that sense of being indoors, inside the house, with ordinary objects on top. I mean, if you think still life, that's probably what you're first going to think of. And the work got complex in terms of its abstract structure. And then another change happened. I was asking myself, why was I back to avoiding this tabletop, this genre where I began? And I had the sense that I needed to go back to square one again and move forward from square one. Go back to the tabletop, go back to ordinary objects that might appear in any classical or contemporary traditional still life. And this is where I ended up. For about a year and a half, I was in a much lighter palette range and working with the tabletop. And at this point, right at the end of that year and a half, I was also discovering an interest in minute detail. You're not going to be able to read it from this.
But if we darken the room, it'll be better.
Try to darken the room. Good.
We bring the lights down.
Just for this. The apricot on the right, I picked up in the local grocery store, and it had little tiny red freckles on it, which probably have a botanical name, but I don't know it. But they were beautiful to me, but I was avoiding them. I wasn't trying in any way to reenact them. And then I thought, why am I avoiding this minute detail? I have loved minute detail all my life. In fact, I have better than 20/20 vision with correction. So I do see a lot of detail. So I tried to find a way to reenact these freckles on the surface of the apricot. And I spent an entire day attempting to do this so that the little red flecks didn't look like they were on the paper surface on the plane, but were on the skin of the pastel. I put them in, I took them out. I put them in, I put them out. I surrounded them. By this time, I'm also breaking the pastel sticks into shards with tiny points in order to craft the sharp edges and do minute detail. At the end of that day, my life partner, Scott, came home from school. He taught full-time at Lebanon Valley College at that time. He came home, went into the studio, walked up to the picture, got over to the right and closer to the apricot, and he said, "Are you sure you want to go there?" And I was pretty sure. I was 95% sure and 5% scared that I was making a real mistake in terms of not only the length of time it would take for me to produce work, but in terms of how my work would be received in the wider world of contemporary art. And I think at that point, something like abandoning that concern happened to me. I was on a path. Felt pretty much alone, and there were these steps ahead of me that I was finding. And at that point, that's really all that mattered to me. And I have to say that that's still true. So the whole idea of becoming a contemporary artist or being seen or labeled as one simply vanished from the horizon for me. It was no longer any kind of conscious goal on my part. So I pursued this minute detail, and after this year and a half, the palette darkened again, and I began to use pure black in the pastel, which I had avoided also at that point, till that point. I want to show you just a bit here. The ideas begin in my mind's eye, as I mentioned, and they usually end up on paper in some form of thumbnail sketch. And then I do a full-scale preliminary drawing in more or less detail, the purpose of which really is for me to understand the value relationships in the final painting all the way through, and the color palette all the way through. Paper, which is what I work on, is not a forgiving medium. There are just so many passes I can make over that paper before the fibers start coming up. I really have to know a lot about what's ahead of me. I cannot make major revisions. So these kinds of drawings are very important. Then there's a transference of that, freehand usually, to the final piece of paper, and I work on the objects here first. All the objects that have minute detail, there's black above this, and when all of that is done, I turn the picture over and add the black atmosphere above, letting all the black pastel dust fall away from the finished areas below. This is called white birch. And at this point, as you can see, I'm still working with the tabletop of traditional still life, although the palette is very dark, and I would say is non-traditional at this point. From 89 to 90, I went through an experimental phase where I was studying individual pieces of leaves and sticks that I found in my rambles. And also in between those intense studies, words began to appear on the undrawn on paper. There were spontaneous smudges from my hand, and I liked that combination for a while. I even thought this may be the major direction I was moving into. Also allowed me to really hone my skills in minute detail. And I did a lithograph also during that series, which contains words and minor sub-images in between the big dramatic parts of it, a line of music at the bottom. A whole lot of things entered this work. I had read at that time Elizabeth Brune's book on writer, and a phrase that stuck there, loading the work. And I put that on my drawing wall. And loading the work was something that I knew was ahead of me. And very soon after this experimental detour happened, I came back to the full-scale, three-dimensional realization of deep space and objects in it. Only the tabletop disappeared. And the bricks that I had found from a neighbor's yard several years earlier suddenly began to appeal to me as an architectural fragment, perhaps the wall of a garden. This is called On the Edge. Actually, looking back, I could say I was really on the edge of the the primary body of work that has completely consumed me ever since. The bricks are broken off on the left-hand side. Behind them there are some twigs and sticks suggesting deeper space behind this wall. Perhaps we're in a garden, and beyond that is wilderness. Here's the detail of some of the objects on the brick wall. I was sticking to the bricks as my subject, not thinking about changing them a lot early on. This is another wall with perhaps wilderness beyond it. It's called Very Old or the Woods. I remember when I finished this, I wrote in my journal, "Nobody is going to love this picture but me." It was the darkest image I had ever made. This is actually the work the Metropolitan bought. So never say never, I guess. And gradually the wall began to get a bit higher, and I began to invent the shape of the wall and forget about the proportions of a normal brick. This is called green gauge. That's a green gauge plum at the bottom. The white bowl is by Toshiko Takasu. The bowl behind it is one of her students and her sort of unofficial son that she adopted, Don Fletcher. Something about student and teacher is going on in this image for me. But I'm showing it because of this. This takes you up close to it, and this is what I was hoping viewers would do. They might see the work from 4 or 5 feet away and get closer and closer and see more of the minute detail, including the craquelure in the glaze. It was that craquelure that was so interesting to me that I wanted to reenact that as well, not merely suggest it. And the wall got bigger, higher, began to dominate many of the images. This is called niche. And this is the first of 3 works of mine in which I've incised into the stone surface, or appear to have incised into it, the initials or names of people in my life I've loved and lost. I wanted to celebrate those people, memorialize them, as it were, in the work. If you get up close to this work in person, you can barely make these things out. My intent was not that other people should, in a sense, get that information, but that maybe they would have a sense that there is more to this image than meets the eye. My favorite American still life painter is Pito, and I love that bulletin board or door panel that says, "More information inside. On the envelope." Important information inside. Thank you. And I wanted to give, in a sense, a feeling that there was more in these images, again, that meet your initial eye contact. This is called columbarium.
You should tell them a little bit about the glass, the tube.
Oh, that's an antique glass bottle, perfume or poison from the 19th century. It doesn't have any names on it, so I don't know who made it or what it was for. I dug up an old bottle in our garden of our previous home. It was a very old house from 1790, and it had this iridescence. The surface was oxidized from burial, like ancient Egyptian glass. And I just got fascinated by that, these sort of spectral little pieces of glass that also always remind me of the human body, and our language for talking about bottles is the same. They have a lip, they have a neck, they have a shoulder, they have a foot. So I began to collect these bottles in flea markets, and they have become they're part of my little repertory of things in the little theater of things that I keep constructing. A columbarium, you probably know, is a niche for the ashes for the dead. But a columbarium in ancient Roman architecture was a niche in a wall into which a beam would be nestled. So this, in a way, invokes, I think, both of those meanings. Although in this image, it isn't ashes in the bottom of the niche, but a beautiful collection of ripe and not quite ripe fruit and green leaves. This is called Angulus, a little evocation for me of the organized chaos of my studio. And I'm showing it to show you these details. This is the surface of part of that image where I've moved from the initial rubbed in and rubbed on layer of multiple colors to making small marks on layers of small marks on that surface, and those marks get smaller and smaller until they don't really read as marks. What you're seeing is the texture of the objects themselves, or at least I hope that's what you're seeing. This is called Leal Souvenir. It's what I think of as an aniconic portrait of Toshiko Takasu. Aniconic in that she is not depicted, but her presence is invoked. Those are her tea bowls on the right in a stack with a very tiny bowl on top inverted. And there are other elements, many other elements in this picture that have to do with her or my relationship with her. There's a small bronze sleigh bell there, and she designed and had made large garden or temple bells. There's a wasp nest. She had a sting as a teacher, which I occasionally encountered. There's a clump of chains. I felt very linked to her, and still feel that link now. There's a sedimentary line in the top of the stone on the left that goes all the way across, which is the outline of the shoreline of New Jersey, turned 90 degrees. So below that is a turned map of New Jersey, and located on it are Princeton, where she had her university studio where she taught and where I met her, and also her own studio in Quakertown is indicated with her double T mark carved into clay. The big gouge in the bottom is the island of Hawaii, actually, where she was born. And the little pale marks, there are 4 of them showing toward the top, to the left of the niche. Those are her fingerprints left in her glaze, which she sometimes would leave there. There are many golden rectangles in this image as well, and part of a spiral that is based on that same ratio.
Dan, this would be a good place also to perhaps mention the light here and in the previous 2, and the use of the light in the studio.
Well, this started in graduate school when I had my little studio area they assigned me, and I positioned my easel and my setups so that the light would come in, the north light would come in from the right. And I did that because Vermeer had been such a hero for me, in a sense, and is still one of my certainly top favorite artists in the world. And I didn't want to be too close to my model or hero. So instead of the light coming from the left, as it almost always does in Vermeer, it comes from the right in my work. And I've kept it that way ever since. In every studio I've set up, I use natural light coming from the north. This is called Ara, which means altar in Latin, and the constellation of Ara is picked out in the stone with those little pocks. It's based loosely on a Mondrian painting. I have a love-hate relationship with Mondrian. I always have. I keep coming back to him. I keep wondering why. Actually, I love the craquelure in Mondrian paintings. Anyway, the sedimentary mark is based on Clifford Still, and the map of the solar system was originally a full-fledged target, and the clutter of things in the lower right corner was based on a Franz Klein painting. Klein is my favorite abstract expressionist artist. A lot of appropriation going on, a lot of my mind just sort of putting together what's in there. This is called The Way Through. This picture, as well as Very Old of the Woods, the one I showed you before, and Breach, which is in the show here, I think of them all 3 of them as landscape fragments. They're very much not inside a house anywhere, and they're just fragments of a much larger landscape. This is actually stone from the forest in back of our house. That shrub was the big shrub on the right of the driveway when you turned in, and that's one of the pipes that mark the boundaries of the property back in the woods. All culled together from drawings and photographs and put together in the studio as an invention. This was the first very tall, thin format picture I did. It's called Stila, S-T-E-L-E, reminiscent of a Greek stela or funeral monument. The idea of it came to me at my father-in-law's funeral. He was a very important figure in Scott's family and in my life. And literally at the funeral, this idea just popped into my mind when the empty rifle shell after the volley that they shot was put into the palm of my hand. I went home after the funeral and I made a thumbnail sketch of this, which is almost exactly what you see here in structure. So all the objects here are related to his life, including the rifle shell, which is in the front overlapping the bottle, and many golden rectangles. This is one of a pair of images in which the basic composition is bookended. Turn the other way. This is called falls. These are the falls or apples that fell out of our apple tree. And this is called yield. These are all the tea bowls that Takasu gave me over the years that lost their battle with the kiln and ended up cracked in one way or another. There's a crack in the big stone in the back, which is the Delaware River between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So her studio is on one side of that crack and my studio is on the other. I've also done a group of pictures that are stacks or cairns. And this was the tallest one. It's called 6 Wooden Blocks. And it just was meant to evoke, or it evoked for me those many times in my childhood when I would dump all the blocks in my trunk out on the floor and try to build the highest possible structure I could. It was inspired by a poem sent to us by our friend, the poet Sally McNall, called 6 Wooden Blocks. And her poem began with 6 words beginning with the letter R. And so there are 6 blocks or printer's blocks with the letter R on them included in this stack, as well as a little Pinocchio figure, which is also made of painted wooden pieces strung together. And this is another of those tall, thin format pictures, and the second one that memorializes people I've lost. I was working on this picture when my mother was in her last months, and she died while I was finishing it, and so I included her initials up in the upper right part of, I don't think you can see them, of the stone. Her initials were V-I-N-C, which is reading down a part of the Latin phrase amor vincit omnia, love conquers all things, which sort of bleeds off the image, but the V-I-N-C is present. And there are many other bits in there, including a little musical line, just 3 notes, mi, sol, fa, da, 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 sort of unresolved little theme, which is a pun for me so far. The outlines of all the states I've lived in are embedded in the structure of this image, as well as the other names and initials of people I've loved and lost. And this is Breach again.
Now, excuse me, Dan has recently been the subject of a major retrospective at Pennsylvania and the Penn State University at the Palmer Gallery, and then a smaller show at Lebanon Valley College. There was an excellent catalog of the exhibitions that was written mostly by Joyce Robinson from the Palmer. And she, when you look at something like this, she sometimes has evoked the light of Caravaggio, the kind of dramatic contrast of Caravaggio. I'm glad that you mentioned the lighting. I think the audience that we had earlier also was very interested in your daily activity, how your normal working day goes. If you want to mention that.
Sure. I think actually somebody asked me if there was any joy or joyful moments during my working day. To which I said, well, I wouldn't use the word joy. No. I'm pretty rigorous in my schedule. There's no way for me to, these works take 4 to 5 months. I work on one image at a time. I've also learned, as I got into the minute detail, that I had to work in 1.5 to 2 hour segments and then take a break and then use my distance eyes. These are muscles in here, and they need to relax. So I have to take a little break and go walk around the house or whatever, do the dishes. So I get up and I get to the easel by 8 or 8:30 in the morning, and the first thing I do is meditate or pray. It's a wonderful job perk I get to have, since I have to do it. Calms me down, slows my breathing, maybe even my pulse. And sometimes during the day I do it again if I'm, riled up by something I'm hearing on NPR. I have to turn that off. And then I work. Once I get started, it's been very difficult for me to stop once I get started. But again, I've learned to time myself. And after 1.5 to 2 hours, I quit, and then I break, and then I come back. And the other really happy part of the day, I'll just say, isn't happy. It's this sense of satisfaction that I get. It's a felt sense. It's bodily there. When that square inch gets to where I want it to be, or I know now I know, it's the combination of these colors in this order that's going to get me there. That feels very good, and there's absolutely nothing like it for me. It's realizing the thing that's been up here, getting this thing out. This is very satisfying. You had a question?
Actually, before you start the questions, we have a mic in the audience because otherwise the people who are recording this wouldn't be able to hear.
Okay.
It's on.
It's on? Okay. Two questions. One is, what paper are you using? And because your backgrounds are so utterly smooth and uniform in color, is that the color of the paper, or are you laying down the black color? And you've got to be awfully precise in terms of how you then put down the images.
Mm-hmm. I use standard Canson Métiant pastel paper, the smooth side of it, not the textured side. I've tried 2 other papers, a French paper and something more recently, pastel matte, I think it's called, just to experiment. They both drove me crazy. And I thought, why am I doing this? I know how to work with these fibers. So I've used Canson the past 40 years. The black is black pastel, which is the most intense hue in the box. It is very powerful. And it goes on, if it's up there, it goes on last. I craft the edges between the objects and the black atmosphere, with a little roughness around there, and those are the most difficult things I have to do. The minute detail is more fun, actually, than the edges. And then I turn at the very end, on my last day. I still haven't seen the whole picture yet. I turn it upside down, and I make, cross-hatching marks with the soft pastel, and then I gently rub it until it's all solidly there, and every bit of the paper is gone. Not visible, is not visible. And then I pound the board, which I do every day anyway, and I turn it over, and I see the whole image for the first time. It's incredible. Which is not the way I was trained to paint. I was trained by Dick Getz and other teachers to work from the whole down to the parts. I was trained to lay in the whole work with basic blocks of color and then break those down into smaller parts and smaller parts. And I cannot work that way with pastel because of the detail that I use. I just can't do it. So,
The vast majority of the pastels that are in the exhibition are done on a toned paper, blue or beige. Is that something you've ever experimented with?
I use a tinted paper. Yes, it's a mid-range gray paper. I don't want to use white because it's harder to cover it with pure black, and I don't want to use black paper because to get the brightest brights is very difficult to do. I could not possibly do this work on black paper. I couldn't make the edges between the lit edges between the leaves and the black paper and let that be black above, because pastel is friable. It's going to spread onto the black paper. I couldn't control that.
And while you're talking about that, we mentioned about the range of color that you use and some of the limitations with the Rembrandt pastels.
Yes, there are limitations. I've tried other pastels as well. Rembrandt is a good formula. It's a good pastel. It's not considered one of the best pastels. It's not Sennelier or Diane Townsend or... Anyway, those pastels are richer in hue. They're also more friable. They can just explode on the paper, and I cannot control them. They will not do what I want to do. So I don't get to use those rich hues. And there are a few areas in the Rembrandt palette, which is quite large. Almost all the yellows and the yellow ochre and the pure white I cannot use. I can use the brightest ultramarine blue as my white. But those other colors are also too friable. So I work with a somewhat limited palette, and I have to strategize to work with that.
Will you talk a little bit more before we open up for questions? That you've sometimes said that people call you a writer, which is something that you don't always admit to, but talk about the role of the writing in your work.
The role of writing in my life has been a moot point. I've written all my life in various ways, but I have written a steady journal for the last 36 years, but an unsteady journal before that, and I have many feet of journals. I love writing. I studied English, as I mentioned. I love reading. I love reading slowly and carefully. I love reading with a pencil. The book that Eric mentioned, Joyce Robinson, the curator, wrote the interpretive biography for that book, but she also urged me, gently, but she got through to me, to publish the 42 backstories I've written about all the major pieces I've done since 1986. After every work is done, I write about the work. And I began that as I do my journals. I wrote that somehow I needed to do it for myself. I needed to talk about this process, where the image came from, what it means to me personally, what it might mean to other people, or might not. I'm not clear at all why I do this, except that I love to write, and it does deeply satisfy me. And I was ultimately, it took me a while to accept this, but I was ultimately very happy that the Archives of American Art asked me to give them, or will to them, all of my preliminary drawings and my journals. So I don't have to burn them. And 100 years from now, when that graduate student in the future gets a job and finds this stuff to work with, and I won't have to know about it. The journals do contain preliminary thumbnail sketches and a lot of writing about the work that I'm doing, the work in process, what's happening, why it isn't working, why I think it isn't working, what I need to try next. But also I write about the weather and what we had for dinner yesterday and the book I'm reading and just anything.
So are there questions that people are ready to ask?
Microphone guy here.
I just want to say I thank you so much for giving this sequential story of how you've progressed your art, but also these relationships that you've had that have had impact and influence on your work. I'd just like to ask you, your work kind of reminds me a little bit of Chuck Close, hyperrealism. And okay. I just like, do you have any reflections about the similarities of the hyperrealism you do and hyperrealism that he has done?
Well, I do tend to gravitate toward any art that is made out of methodical, small mark making. My closest artist friend right now is Jo Margulies, and she is primarily an abstract drawer. She works in ink on paper, making minuscule marks. And we talk about everything regarding our work and our personal lives as well, but I just adore her work. And I know that a large part of it is that I can see on paper, I can almost see on paper time, the time that went into this, the concentration, and of course the bodily effort, and it just deeply moves me. So I get drawn to Chuck Close's work, even the more recent work, which is now all these fluid little painterly marks, but within squares, yeah.
Your work styles are very similar. I hear a little bit of...
Yes, I've read a bit about his working method. I remember reading about his working method in graduate school before this thing happened, and I remember saying to my graduate school friends, I will never work like that. Oh, yeah. Whoops.
Do you want to talk about, excuse me, the story of your relationship, your engagement with galleries?
Sure. Yeah. So we moved to Pennsylvania in 1983, and Scott got full-time work at Lebanon Valley College teaching music theory and composition. He's now retired, and he's a full-time composer. That's wonderful. But we had agreed together that I would give this thing 2 years. I thought I could make art for 2 years and not sell anything and not bring any bread to the table. I could do that, maybe. But beyond that, I couldn't do it, I thought. I'm not made that way. It's my middle-class working ethic. It's my parents and what they taught me. And if I spent my life making work that nobody bought, I too would go out in the cornfield and shoot myself, maybe after 3 years. So I gave myself 2 years, and I thought I would work that 2 years and create a body of work and then approach galleries. After 6 months, I was stir-crazy. I'd never been housebound before, which is what I felt I was. Scott would come home from work, and I would run to the door like a dog, wanting to be patted. Anyway, I had gotten a list of possible galleries from Elizabeth Brune. She ultimately became the director of it was in the National American Art Museum, now SAM. Elizabeth Brune was the director of the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas when I was there, and I got hired as the matter in the print department at the Spencer, and I knew Elizabeth and everybody else in the little museum. And she liked my work. Betsy liked my work. There was no mentoring in the studio art department, really, from my teachers, a little bit from Roger. But I went to Betsy, and I said, I'm moving east. What would you suggest I do next? And she said, well, I'm going to give you a short list of galleries in New York. And she did. And I'm going to give you a list of a few curators in art museums, and I want you to call them. And I said, you've got to be kidding. I'm not calling Ann Percy at the Philadelphia Museum of Art out of the blue. And she said, look, these are wonderful people. They will be delighted that you called and that you bring your work to them. So I got to Pennsylvania. 6 months later, I went to Philadelphia, actually first, to the Academy, and I met Judy Stein, who was on Betsy's list. And Judy said, sure, come in. I took in a portfolio. She went through it. She picked up the phone. She called Richard Rosenfeld who had a gallery of work on paper in Philadelphia at that time. Richard loved my work. He said, I want to represent you. It doesn't happen like that. Then after a year, Richard said, you don't belong in Philadelphia. I love your work. I want your work, but it's not going to sell here. I sold one piece in 1 year. You have to go to New York. So I got out Betsy's list again, and I screwed my courage to the sticking place, and I went into New York with my little slide list and my Vita, which was really short, and a small pastel framed and under glass. I wanted somebody to see the real surface. And I went to the Sholkoff Gallery. Robert? No, I first went to Sholkoff. Robert Sholkoff? Do you know him? Okay, Robert Sholkoff. He was at that time representing William Bailey and some other highfalutin people in the realist Renaissance in New York. Sholkoff said, I'll take your slides. I don't want to look at the real thing, and he walked away from me. I got back in the elevator, got down in the elevator. It opened automatically on the Tatashev Gallery, where he was having a solo show of pastel on paper by a West Coast artist. So I just walked in, met Peter. We talked for half an hour, and he said, I think I'll take a chance on you. So here I am, this, naive kid from the Great Plains, going into New York, and a gallery on 57th Street, an agent says, I'll take a chance on you. I'm standing there in front of Peter, who was like 6'5". My knees were literally shaking, which I thought was a metaphor, but it isn't. And I looked at him, and I channeled Takasu, my mentor. I literally did, just real quickly. And I didn't smile. And I looked at him and I said, I think I'll take a chance on you. I thought it worked both ways. I was taking a chance. But he was really taking a chance. He told me later, this is not how it happens. I didn't know you from Adam. You walked in off the street. And 2 weeks later, he began to sell the work. So I entered that market at the right moment and in the right gallery. It was just a gift. It was just a gift.
Question over here? Just let the mic arrive. Thanks.
I was wondering about some of the preparations you use for your support. So do you ever do sanded papers? Do you ever do underpaintings? Do you do any of that stuff? Or we just do kids all the time?
It's just the paper. And then I transfer my preliminary drawing using a very soft pencil so that I do not... It's just on a masonite board, taped to the masonite board. 2 pieces of paper to give it a little bit of foundation. No, I'm just stupid. It's simply how I started, and it became how I worked, and I've rarely pushed past that.
Before Bruce asks his question, let me also, since you asked about support, you may have noticed that the frame is very different from the normal frames that we have in the gallery. And that's because, in fact, Dan designs the frames, and for very specific reasons.
I do. I got to a point in the mid-'80s where I was framing these as drawings with visible mats, and I was struggling with the colors that matte producers make, and none of the colors fit any of my pictures. I didn't like that. And then I thought, well, I want to frame these as paintings. I am painting. I didn't want the paper showing around the pastel painting. But commercial frames have a rabette in the back that's, about that deep, into which the matte and glass package fits. But that's also where the pressure goes. So if the final pastel paper is too close to that pressure all the way around, it'll just buckle. It needs to be in a mat this wide, hinged at the top, floating, and just sort of breathe a little bit with the atmosphere around it. So I had to design these frames that have a wide rabbet in back. The mats are hidden. They're back there, but they're hidden to the eye. So I design the frames, I find the wood that I want, the wood texture that I want. A local cabinet maker builds them for me. He's very, very good and does hidden splines that keep the corners together. And then I know a lot about wood finish, and so I put a finish on the frame.
Bruce.
I had a question about the painting that I think it was called Angularities, with the numerous bottles of different sizes, levels, and heights. Immediately when I looked at it, to me, it reminded me of a cityscape or skyscrapers of various heights. Did you have that in mind at all?
There actually have been maybe a couple of works in which the idea of an urban structure, complex urban structure, was in my mind. It's not on this PowerPoint, the one I would like to show you, but yes, that's been there for me. I love looking at architecture. We travel to look at architecture and painting as well, but especially architecture. So architecture gets into this work in funny ways.
We often talk about an exhibition as if it were to spring full-blown from the head of Zeus, without giving, I think, appropriate credit in this regard. And so Stacy Sell was the curator for the exhibition, along with Kim Schenk, who is here as well and deserves a great deal of credit for the presentation of the work, for the research on the work. Sometimes you read a whole article in a newspaper where they never mention that there's a curator who had to propose the idea, who had to support the idea, who had to go to marketing, who had to go defend the idea. And this is an important consideration, that we don't put their names in front of the exhibitions, but they deserve a great deal of credit. And the idea of adding Dan's work to the collection, Charlie Ritchie and other people, this is an important consideration as well. There are things that have never been shown before. There are things that have never been shown together. And so I just want to acknowledge their importance as well before we go to the next question.
Can we?
So you mentioned that some of your favorite artists were Vermeer and Franz Klein, and your love-hate relationship with Mondrian. And you mentioned the books that you put in your journal. Can you tell us who some of your favorite writers are? Or what you're reading now?
Gosh.
Just curious.
Okay, that's a long list. So I did my undergraduate thesis on Shakespeare. I did my master's paper on George Eliot. Oh, it's George Eliot's birthday today, by the way. There you go. Happy birthday, Marianne. And I still love Shakespeare and 19th century fiction, British and American. Favorite writers are Jane Austen and Willa Cather, Charles Dickens. I'm a member of a Dickens reading group. We meet every week and read out loud together. We're reading A Tale of Two Cities right now. I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. Except that which is thrust on me by well-meaning friends. And I occasionally read something I really, really love. But mostly I read Elizabethan poetry and drama and 19th century and early 20th century fiction and poetry.
Do you like Morandi?
We're talking about Morandi at lunch, and you weren't there.
No. That's why I had to ask.
Around? My gosh. Yes, I do. Very, very much. His austere, dry, parched little still lives are just hugely appealing to me. And I mentioned to Kim at lunch that I've tried teaching from Morandi. When I've taught at Lebanon Valley College, Introduction to Drawing and Pastel as a painting medium, I've tried to use Morandi, and I don't know if it's the students that I've run into there or the times or whatever, but Morandi has never caught fire in any of those students, and I sometimes wonder if he's an artist you need to come to after you've been looking at a lot of other art from many eras, and then you find this quiet intensity. But yes, I love Morandi.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
Hi, I was first introduced to your work at the Arkansas Arts Center exhibition you did in 2012, and was just blown away by it. So, I'm happy that you came to do this today. I'm just curious if you still work in oil at all.
No, I don't. I've thought about it, but I just haven't done it. I've done a few plein air pieces, landscape things with pastel, just as a little vacation. And I do still draw a good deal, not just preliminary drawings. I do work with pencil or graphite, because I do love pencil. I told my high school friends, bury me with a pencil. I hadn't found pastel yet. Well, I do appreciate your attention. It's very gratifying. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.